a little bit.
Yeah, I met him a half a dozen times. He was interested in the American Italian Historical Association. Came
Sure.
around to some of our meetings, bought a lot of our books for his library,
Mhm.
and he was on the committee that hosted maybe two different conferences that AHA did in New Orleans.
Uh-huh.
Are you familiar with the writers in town? You socialize with them?
Well, I'm not well. I was traveling there at least once a year for many years, and then the last half dozen years or so, I've been sort of sidelined up here with family responsibilities and some medical stuff, and I find it. I haven't been there in about 6, 7 years now. Um,
They used to have a conference at the Monteleone Hotel of
mhm.
writers, and uh, I, Joe and I were invited to make a presentation regarding the book we did on New Orleans,
Oh,
and
nice.
I met Andre Kroshescu, or whatever his name is,
Sure, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
and we ended up going to have after hours drinks at Kojescu's apartment, which is
Nice.
right there in the French Quarter.
Yeah.
It was a really big deal. He was big on NPR in those days.
Sure, I remember that. Yeah.
Do you have any idea what happened to him? Is he still around or?
I've been thinking about him lately. I don't know. I know there was a bar in the quarter that he used to hang out at. And but I haven't heard him mentioned in a while. I don't know, he's sort of fallen off the radar.
Mhm.
The one guy I did know from that whole scene was Joe DeSalvo, who was the owner of Faulkner Books up behind the cathedral. It used to be
Mhm.
William Faulkner's home, and he and his wife uh, organized a literary festival every spring, I believe. But I just knew him from stopping in there. He's a nice guy. He just passed away a few months back. Um, well, what a great guy. Very
Yeah.
supportive, wonderful, wonderful person. Very well respected and loved around the community.
I think it's time to start. I'm pleased today to have with us someone whose subject matter is really topical this week. This is the 130th anniversary of the lynching that took place in New Orleans of 11 Sicilians after they were, um, most of them were declared innocent or not guilty. And a mob of maybe 10,000 people uh, stormed the jail and pulled them out and murdered 11 of them. It's well, I think our guest today will tell you more about it. But Tom Smith is a freelance writer who penned the book about 10 years ago entitled Crescent City Lynching. And he also focused on the murder of Chief of Police in New Orleans, Chief Hennessy. So I'm glad to introduce today Tom Smith, maybe our first person with no Italian name. Do you have any Italian background?
No, but I grew up in Hamden, Connecticut, which so I can almost pass.
Oh, okay. Connecticut, I think, has become the most Italian of the states, surpassing Rhode Island.
I've heard that. Yeah. Yeah. I have two musician friends who are from Chicago, and they occasionally get into big debates about the relative merits of Chicago versus New Haven pizza. So
Oh, okay. Well,
perhaps you
it's
can
all,
get,
it's all good. It's all good.
that's
Tom,
that's that's the verdict. Yeah.
tell us, you're telling us a little bit about your background, and tell us about how you came to write the book and
Okay.
uh, the contents, the new aspects of it that you contributed, and then the reaction to the book.
Okay. Um, in the late 19 '80s, I had been writing for a local paper in New Haven for a number of years, and I was looking around for something a little more serious to do, and a friend of mine suggested that because of my love in New Orleans, that I write something about the city. I'd lived there for a while in the late '70s, and I thought, my God, the bookshelves are groaning with books about New Orleans. What could I possibly do? And he said, well, what are you reading for fun? And I happen to be reading Nicholas Pileggi's Wise Guy, the book that Goodfellas was based upon. And he said, well, why don't you write a crime book about New Orleans? And the most sensational crime story I had ever heard about in New Orleans was related to the incident at the parish prison and Chief Hennessy's murder. And first, my exposure to it came through Herbert Asbury's book, The French Quarter. Asbury was a newspaper guy who wrote a couple of books, sort of distillations of like the seedy underbelly of this city or that. He did one about New Orleans, another about San Francisco called The Barbary Coast. And of course, he's famously known for writing the book Gangs of New York, which was loosely the basis for the Scorsese movie.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, I was under the mistaken impression that nobody had written about this. Now, mind you, this was in the late '80s. I wasn't yet aware of Dr. Gambino's book, Vendetta. And I was definitely not aware of Dr. Nelly's book, The Business of Crime, which has got an excellent distillation of the whole, very nuanced view of the Hennessy murder, the trial, and the whole impact on the Italian American community, both New Orleans and nationally. If I'd read Nelly's treatment of this, I probably would have stopped immediately, because he and I kind of wound up in the same place, or very close to it, certainly. So not knowing any better, I researched the story for a couple of years. I spent many, many hours in the New Orleans Public Library. There were no official remaining court transcripts. However, the local papers down there printed daily transcripts of what had happened in the courtroom. So by putting the three major papers side by side, you could come up with a pretty good picture of exactly what was said and the evidence that was presented. And there was sort of an alternative view coming from a small newspaper called The Mascot, which was kind of like a scandal rag that was sort of did not look well upon the local establishment. So with sort of The Mascot keeping the version I was getting from the other papers honest, you could sort of posit what the real story was. So really, most scholarship about the case, regardless of who's written about it, is on the shoulders of the newspaper people of the time. Anyway, I came back with about 600 pages worth of microfilm newspapers and sat down and started trying to piece together what had happened. I did not have any agenda in trying to write a book about it. The more I read about it and the more versions I had read about it from over the 100 years or so since these incidents had happened, I found that you'll find very, very different perspectives on what people, how people presented the case. You might say it became a bit of a political football for a long time. So I thought, well, what was needed was somebody to just step in and just write a very, as factual as possible treatment of it. And so I just I refused to take any preconceptions about it. I just decided I wouldn't trust anyone's word or anybody's verdict about what had happened, and just see if I could come up with a straightforward narrative that people could sort of refer to and as a starting point. And culturally, they could come up with their own conclusions. So It took a little over 2 years to get the book together, and I interested an agent in it, and then it sat around for 15 years,
Oh, really?
accumulating. Oh yeah, accumulating rejection slips. And in 2005, I was at the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival, and I got an email from the agent saying, "I hope you're sitting down. I think I have a buyer for the book." So, we were very excited. The contract was signed, and a few months later, Hurricane Katrina devastated the city.
Oh, wow.
And it was thought that it would be, the publishers wanted to wait on it. So it was not published until 2007. Um, uh, After that, I got the opportunity to speak to a lot of Italian American organizations and libraries, both up here and in New Orleans, which was a great experience for me, a real privilege. I met around a lot of really great people doing that. That was my that was my real payment for doing the book. And after 3 years, we found out, I went to look for it in a particular bookstore down south, and come to find out it was out of print and nobody had told us. So in any case, within those 3 years, it made it into quite a few libraries, and I guess it sold okay. I'll never know. But it did manage to see print. I was, pleased with the way that the publishers handled it, for the time that it was in print. So at least we got it done, and it's out there. And that kind of where that sort of brings us up to, I realize that was 10 years ago, but as far as the book goes, that's how it all came together.
Okay. I assume that you've seen the movie of Vendetta.
I have seen it, yes. It's not,
And
I wouldn't depend on it for history.
yeah, it wasn't a really engaging movie. Unfortunately, I thought that could be the vehicle to make this story really well known, but uh, uh, they get points for trying and
Sure.
engaging a big star, but it didn't do the trick.
Right.
Uh,
I thought the thing in the PBS special about the Italian Americans that was out a few years ago, uh,
yeah,
there was a short segment about it in there. They asked me to participate in it, so I got a little, um, you know, speaking part in there, commenting on this story. I was terrified.
yeah,
um, but they got a couple of other people who were, they made all three of us look good, which is nice. But in the course of about 5 minutes, I thought they did a good job of explaining the entire narrative factually, and presenting it in a good way. So I was very happy with the way they did that.
uh, you think New Orleans was any any more prejudiced against Italians or the other than other places in the South or North? Or,
Um, the Italians were. I think it would be hard to make a comparison whether, there was an Italian. There were almost at the time of the murder and the lynching. There were almost like two different Italian communities there. Um, there were a number of Italian Americans who had been there for a while that were very well respected within the community. Um, and then also you had this influx of like 1,000 Sicilians arriving a week, or whether they were going to work in the city or in farm communities elsewhere in the state. And they poured into the French Quarter, which they referred to as Little Palermo in those days. A
mhm.
lot of poverty and disease and and some crime. So you almost had, it was almost like the north-south divide you hear about with in Italy itself, where you've got these folks who've been there for a while, who've kind of made it, and well respected in the community, and the newcomers bore the brunt of most of the prejudice there.
Yeah.
And if you read the newspapers at the time, both in New Orleans and elsewhere in the country, um, it's surprising how closely a lot of the descriptions of the new arrivals mirrors a lot of the stuff that we read in um, some of the press today, and certainly, let's say, if you look at the comments section on a newspaper website, um,
Yeah.
you'll see a lot of the same characterizations. You could almost just change the ethnicity of the people, and it's not much has changed.
Yeah. My knowledge of some of this is a little bit hazy, but I remember that like in 1850, there were probably more Italians in New Orleans than maybe any place else in the United States. And that they community kept growing there, but New York, of course, and Philadelphia and Chicago grew at a faster pace on a larger scale. But
I think you're right. I think at the time, I think New Orleans may have been the largest, the busiest port of entry for Italians.
yeah, maybe about 25,000 or something.
Yeah, it was previous to the big influx of arrivals in New York later, certainly.
Yeah.
I
And
Go ahead.
so was it a commercial thing? The Italians were getting too strong politically or economically, and that they needed to. That's the theme in the movie that's very strong, and I think Gambino pushes that as well.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sold on it, because, for example, as I said, there were other more established. There were Italian business people in the city who were uh, more respected and more powerful than the guys who were some of the groups that were involved in the Hennessy and story.
Hmm.
Um, and I think the conclusion is that some of the lynching effectively wrecked let's just call it Italian control of the docks. Let's just characterize it that way. Um, it didn't. I mean, the same families continued to work unloading fruit, and Mayor Shakespeare, who was one of the great villains of this story, was still complaining about it a year or so after the lynching. So in that respect, not a lot changed. Um, my feeling about the political aspect of this is that the the city government at the time was a reform administration that was uh, they were certainly a lot less corrupt than the crowd that had preceded them, who were really really criminals. So these guys, this Shakespeare and it was called the Young Men's Democratic Association. They were considered to be a reform administration, and these are the crew that hired Hennessy out of private law enforcement security practice he was working with. Um, a lot of them were members of the city's financial and political elite, the uptown aristocratic crowd, a lot of lawyers. Um, and there was a subsequent mayor, Martin Behrman, who was a genius at municipal machine politics. Remember these guys as um, guys that could quote you Thomas Jefferson and everything about the Roman Empire, but they didn't know anything about garbage collection. They were really not good at the mechanics of municipal administration. So my feeling is that when the Hennessy murder happened and the defendants were acquitted, um, I think that this crowd sort of looked at this and thought, well, we can't be seen to not be perceived as not being able to handle this. And I think that was, this is just my personal take on it. I think that they felt that we've got to do something to show that we're really in charge and we haven't bobbled the whole thing. Because I get into this during the course of the book. There were a lot of minor scandals and just things that they did. The city government did very badly leading up to the trial. And I think the acquittals were sort of like the seen as the final insult to these guys. And they said, we've got to step in and make an example out of this, in this case, to show that we haven't lost control of the city. So that, more than trying to quash the growing Italian power on the docks, to me, it was the real political story there.
Very interesting, the subject or the definition of reform.
Oh, yeah.
What exactly is it?
Well, it depends upon who's sitting in the mayor's chair, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But being from Chicago, you probably don't know much about that sort of thing.
No. Now, New Orleans is a strong Italian town
Yeah.
these days, and maybe traditionally the Monteleone Hotel is right there in the French Quarter. It's been there for a long time. Several of the mayors have been Italians in New Orleans, and when I was doing the book with Joe Maselli, he was always sending me more pictures of successful Italians, and they're Sicilians, Sicilian descendants, and they're judges and all sorts of prominent people. And actually, Maselli's son was in Chicago on the weekend, and he claimed that the descendants of both sides in the lynching, the lynchers and the lynchees, were now friends and business associates.
Sure. Yeah, the city government, there was the city officially apologized a year or two ago.
Yeah, we
know about that. And there's a great picture of I think one of Hennessy's descendants and one of the descendants of one of the lynching victims, like shaking hands or with their arms around each other, like, everything's worked out okay,
So I guess if all things pass.
Yeah. There's a little side note to this. When I was going down there a lot to speak about the book, I met a gentleman named Don Gennaro, and Don told me that his ancestors had lived next door to Chief Hennessy and his mother, and he said they were great friends. Hennessy occasionally in some of the treatments over the years has been painted as a rabidly racist anti-Italian police chief, but apparently these folks were great neighbors. Unfortunately, when the murder happened, the Sicilians in the city were terrified with good reason. Mass arrests and people getting beaten in the street and so forth. And Don's ancestors were so frightened by this that they actually moved back to Sicily.
Oh, well, I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, and now in the succeeding years, one of the relatives moved back to New Orleans, and that's how Don's parents ended up there. But he remembered the whole story, the lineage of the story, right from back to the time when his folks lived next door to Dave Hennessy and his mom.
Okay, did your book solve the mystery of who killed the chief?
It did not, and I think people can get into some great arguments about that. I did try to lay out as much information as possible so that people could, perhaps come to their own conclusions. I do think, however, And for me, this was the takeaway of the whole experience, was that, you know, if I didn't solve the crime, one thing that is not in doubt is the effect that this had on the Italian American community down there. You know, the let's call it collateral damage from this, the fallout from to the Italian American community. There's no mystery about this. You know, it was very traumatic. I mean, for years, you know, it was the local insult. Somebody wanted to insult an Italian, say, "Who killed a chief?" You know, as a common local insult. This case was the first time the word mafia really came into widespread usage, not only in New Orleans, but around the country. So, you know, Italian Americans have had to deal with that ever since. And this was the first case where broadly where that word came into common usage around the country. So there was a lot of negative stuff about that, which there's no mystery. You know, people can argue about who actually killed Hennessy, and you know, I did make note in the book that, you know, the guy was a municipal police chief, and he had a long list of enemies. I did get into that in the book. There were, you know, he and Shakespeare were very much at odds with the local gambling community. Some years before, Hennessy had shot to death a guy who was the chief of detectives on the New Orleans police force. And there's a man named Thomas Devereaux, who was in the act of trying to kill Hennessy's cousin, Mike. There was a gun battle right in the street, and whether there's some great deal of dispute over what happened, but basically David Hennessy, who later became the chief, prevented Devereaux from killing his cousin by walking up behind him and shooting him in the head. So there is a theory that Devereaux's friends had a long-standing grudge against Hennessy and may have had something to do with his murder. So that's another thread in the story that's still alive.
Series.
Sorry?
That could be a whole series of films.
Oh, sure. Yeah. You know, it's funny. I was reading a book about there's a great writer in Texas named Skip Hollandsworth, who has written for Texas Monthly for many years. And a couple of years ago, he wrote a book about a series of axe murders in Austin, Texas. And I'm a big fan of Hollandsworth's writing, so I sat down one summer to read it. And about halfway through it, this detective from New Orleans named Mike Hennessy turns up. And Mike was sort of a sketchy character, to say the least. And I'm reading this stuff and I'm thinking, and Hollandsworth wasn't aware of any connection to the New Orleans story. But I'm reading Mike's antics over in Texas, trying to, you know, solve these crimes over there, and bilking the local government trying to bilk them out of all kinds of money for his detective services. And I thought, man, that's him. So, you know, there are all these little side things issues that you can explore.
And New Orleans is, I've been there many times, but I've never found the exact location. This phone's going crazy here. Anyhow, where in New Orleans, if I want to go and see it, where did the lynching happen?
It's in the neighborhood called Tremay. You know where Louis Armstrong Park is? I've lost your audio, Dom.
He may be taking care of that phone call.
I only know the French Quarter.
Okay. If you go walking, I don't know if I would necessarily recommend walking there from the French Quarter, but if you were to walk straight from from the river through the quarter, you would pass over North Rampart Street, and Louis Armstrong Park is there. And the parish prison was on the other side of where Louis Armstrong Park is now. It's sort of, if you were to look at a map of the quarter and Louis Armstrong Park, it would sort of be like in the upper left, just on the other side of the upper left-hand corner of Louis Armstrong Park. Matter of fact, there's a municipal arts center there, has been built there. So I'm not quite, I don't recall whether that's actually been built over the property or it's the next block over, but it's in that neighborhood. No, I've lost you again.
There's nothing there that commemorates the event.
No.
But New Orleans does have a nice statue there on the riverfront
Yes.
of the immigrant family.
Mhm. Yeah, again, this is my personal feeling, but I think that's a better memorial to the Italian community there and everything that they accomplished and suffered. A lot of the guys, the people who were, there's some gray areas in the past of the people who were killed at the prison. There's under no circumstances would I condone what happened to them. But some of these guys were not model citizens either. Nobody should be subjected to that. But
Yeah.
I think I think the larger tragedy was to the community at large. So in my view, I think the memorial down by the river is actually a better testament to the community.
So they weren't declared innocent, they were declared not guilty.
Yeah, kind of like that. Yeah.
Yeah, Carla has.
And some of these guys, mind you, some of these people who were lynched hadn't even gone to trial yet.
Mhm. Carla Simonini is our professor of Italian American Studies at Loyola,
Mhm.
is out there with a question.
Yes.
Hi, it's nice
Hi.
to meet you, Mr. Smith. I haven't read your book, but I have read Richard Gambino's, Vendetta,
Sure.
and seen the movie version of it as well. And I actually just did a little segment about the lynchings in my class. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I just turned it up a little bit. I can hear you fine. Yeah.
Okay, I'm in my office and I don't have a good system here, but
No, we're good.
a few things are coming to mind.
Mhm.
One is who killed the chief seems to be kind of irrelevant. It's sort of like whether or not Sacco and Vanzetti were really guilty or innocent. It's not that's not the issue. It's more like, why did it happen? What were the circumstances that led up to this happening where these men could be rounded up like that and killed? I think that's what resonates more for me. The other
Okay.
thing I was thinking about was the different types of immigrants that you're talking about. Certainly I think it was Makeka was one of the men who was prominent in the community, and he was brought in on charges. And in Gambino's book, he makes it a point of his position of power and wealth allowed him to hire good counsel, which seemed to have assisted with the men that were, there were 8 that were found not guilty, and there were 3 that was declared a mistrial. So there's class that gets mixed in on there, but it's interesting that when push came to shove, like ethnicity seemed to have trumped class in terms of him being brought into the fold and arrested along with the others there. Gambino's reading seems to think he was rather incredulous about that, or didn't expect that, because he thought he had achieved, quote unquote, the American dream, so what to say. So
Sure.
yeah. I just
Yeah.
wondering if you could comment on, where your book comes down on some of those issues in terms of comparing it to what I've read with Gambino.
Sure. It's been a while since I've read it. I in broader terms, I agree with you certainly about the being beside the point. Your earlier point about it being beside the point. I found that there were other Italians in the city who were wealthier and more more established, both respected in business and certainly wealthier um, than Makeka. So I didn't see him as a symbol of the pinnacle of Italian power in the
Well, I
city.
don't think the pinnacle, but certainly he was somebody who was a cut above. I mean, he was,
Yeah.
yeah.
I tended to see him more as someone who was striving towards that. I think the matter of fact, the guys that the family that he was working with, the Matrangas, I think were probably better off both financially and socially than he was.
Yeah.
You know, we're really, you know, it's just great slight grades of class that we're
Right.
talking about.
Mhm.
But he was a guy who was always trying to appear to be, you know, one of the crowd. I mean, he was involved in the, you know, the White League.
Yeah, he was engaged in civic life in the city,
Oh,
and
sure,
he was at the theater the night that the actual shooting occurred. That was one of the, yeah,
sure,
yeah,
yeah. Hard to say, you know.
yeah.
Um, I've sort of lost the thread here.
Oh, no, that's, no, you really, you seem to answer my question. And as a follow-up, I hope, don't want to take up too much time. Is there anyone else that has a question? But
Yeah.
the, you talked about how the newspaper accounts related the incident and
Yes.
the way they talked about the immigrants, the Italians and that. And I did the same thing. I gave my students excerpts from the newspapers to read out of context and ask them, what group do you think these are referring to? I
Yeah.
didn't even tell them what history or, what year they came from. And a lot of them said, oh, they must be talking about Muslims or Mexicans or things. So that rhetoric that keeps getting
Yeah.
reused in the anti-immigrant sentiment is very powerful and very present. And the other thing not to overlook is the issues with race.
Mhm.
How the Italians were considered sort of racially in between at that point. They were still suspect. I mean, a lot of them came over in the South to replace the labor that they lost. They were looking for cheap labor to replace what the slaves used to do. And in the early days, the communities, especially the Sicilians, they lived side by side with the African Americans. So there was this, the Jim Crow mentality and the racism played into the anti-Italian prejudice as well. I mean, that's my reading. I didn't know if that was something that came up in your research also.
My feeling about that was that all of these events that we're talking about were sort of a lull between the violence of the Reconstruction and the Jim Crow era.
Mhm.
So it wasn't so much of a black and white issue at that time. But you're right, the Italians were considered almost like a third separate and inferior race, certainly characterized that way by a lot of the participants in this story. And I know from what you're speaking of, I know that there are plentiful examples of this, both in the history and the rhetoric of the time. I think that was an excellent exercise that you did with the newspapers. One thing which surprised me, I examined a lot of press accounts that were contemporary with the lynching. And I didn't find a geographical pattern to it. There were a lot of Southern newspapers that condemned it in the harshest terms. And on the other hand, you've got the New York Times and a lot of, Northern papers defending the mob.
Yeah, those are the excerpts I had. They were from the Times. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
there's the Roosevelt quotation about it was a rather good thing.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
in a letter that he wrote. Yeah.
Yeah, he's mouthing off to his sister, I believe.
Yes.
Luckily, he was not in a position of power at the time. But yeah, it just.
Let's talk a little bit about the term mafia.
Yeah.
Most of the writers have said that this is when mafia became identified with Italian Americans, and it's something that has stuck for another 130 years.
Sure. Well, the story of this story was carried throughout the country as a major event. The first instance of the word coming, that came up, I think, is one of the, there were a series of related trials between two of the Italian and Italian American groups that were working, vying for control of the fruit unloading business. And there was a shooting incident, and I believe that the word came up in one of those trials. I think that's the first instance of it. But after the Hennessy murder, the newspapers all over the country. Prior to that, it was called the Vendetta. You know, they think, well, hot-blooded Italians killing each other. You know, a sort of cartoon version of a racial stereotype, really, and just characterizing. I mean, any community's got violence in it, especially poor immigrant communities. But as far as Little Palermo was concerned, they tagged that as the most crime as being as a result of the vendetta. So when the word mafia came along, that became the new catchphrase for all of that stuff. And the newspapers throughout the country carried it. I mean, it just, I don't think, you can discuss with people who are more conversant with the history of organized crime in the country, how relevant that was to this New Orleans thing or not. But certainly as far as public perception goes, yeah, this was a major a major reason that Americans came to know the word.
Okay, let's go around the horn here with questions or comments. Lou Corsino, I always call on you. I always know you've got something challenging and intellectual.
Yeah, you always put pressure. I never achieve the expectations that you have for me. One of the one of the questions that I have, I had one comment is I think the North-South division that you talked about in New Orleans, I think is underplayed throughout our history of Italians in America, even today. I think that's a critical distinction that hasn't really been played out. I think it's still in Italy today. So I think that's an interesting sort of theme. But I guess what I'm interested in is, Tom, what you said about the reverberations in other communities. You said it was awful for the Italian Americans in New Orleans, but do you have any information or any sense of how the Italians in other cities sort of responded to the real negative, some New York Times saying this is a good thing? Did that have a chilling effect on Italians in the neighborhood so as to make them almost, pull back from trying to be Americans, trying to go out there in some particular way, the experiences of the lynchings and the like?
I don't know if I can answer that as well as I'd like to, but I can tell you that there was a lot of solidarity forthcoming from Italian American communities elsewhere, is trying to aid people who had suffered in New Orleans as a result of this, financially, and contributions to the families. Of course, from the people who are convinced that this was just a huge instance of organized crime run amok. These were seen as criminal payments. The mafia is funding, sending all this money down there to continue the work of the mafia. There was a lot of solidarity from Italian American organizations in other parts of the country.
And the newspapers especially, they played it up big in the Chicago Italian papers. And there were some general American papers who were aghast by the atrocity there. But it's amazing that there weren't more on that.
But I would imagine that if you were an Italian at that time, and you had the Ku Klux Klan, you had this vigilantism.
Mhm.
Eventually, you had the Palmer raids. I mean, that would make you want to stay in your house, I think, if you're Italian. I mean, I think
Oh, yeah.
I think there would be a, when you put it all together, you could see a, you know, in real dramatic form, an anti-Italianism at work to make you sort of pull back from
But
the experience.
Yeah, there were instances of Italians being harassed and assaulted in other parts and arrested in other parts of the country as a result of what had happened
Oh,
in New
really?
Orleans. I mentioned a couple of them. Um, I noted a few of them in the course of my research.
Mhm.
It wasn't a really massive thing that happened throughout the country, but incidents of that sort of thing were recorded in different parts of the country, everywhere from New York to Denver. I think there was pretty sure there was an incident out in Colorado as a result of it.
That's it.
of course, the Italian government reacted
Oh, yeah.
strongly. And it was a concern of the president in dealing with foreign policy. And they say that's one of the reasons why he declared Columbus Day, Columbus Day, official federal Columbus Day
And,
in 92.
First National Columbus Day,
The
not
first
the
national.
federal. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
No, the
Yeah, well-
federal wasn't until the 1970s. So
The,
as far as another, I don't mean to just break in, but
Yeah.
as far as the official response of the Italian government, a colleague of mine has written a book about that, which talks how that was instrumental in pushing anti-lynching legislation through Congress. Although it wasn't entirely successful, pressure from the Italian government led to the introduction of different bills and things like that,
Mhm.
and right into the early part of the 20th century. So there was also that.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how the repercussions of something like this sort of live on for a generation or more and sort of manifest themselves in legislation, both for good and ill.
But Italians in America were, were not intimidated against participation in the labor movement and in the radical aspects of the labor movement. The biggest ethnic segment of the Socialist Party in 1920 was the Italian segment. And while we know, of course, about Sacco and Vanzetti, they were uh, very radical as well. And so the Italians weren't intimidated, at least in the area of the labor organizing.
Yeah, and even prior to that, getting back to the control of the docks after the lynching. As I mentioned earlier, Mayor Shakespeare was complaining for the longest time after the lynching, when he supposedly, destroyed Italian power in New Orleans. The guys who were in charge of the fruit unloading business were driving him nuts a year later. And of course, politically, he passed from the scene, and the companies were still there. They survived and flourished after he was gone.
Okay, more questions. Let's see. Kathy DiNicolo, I think you had a question, comment?
Yeah, hi, everyone.
there.
And thank you for the presentation, Tom.
Sure.
You know, when you were talking about comparing your article to a modern piece written today, you
Mhm.
just substituted Italian for the minority,
Mhm.
today's minorities. I thought, this is a really good lesson in social justice. Maybe social justice gone amok in terms of the rioting and in terms of the lynchings, but still the idea of the Italian community and the whole working toward this idea of social justice in so many ways.
Mhm.
And in looking at so many of the things of the shows that have been video via Espresso Online, I see a very deep commitment to this idea of social justice. Do you run across any of that, Tom, in your review of the information for the book?
It was more something, it sort of presented itself more as food for thought rather than as something that was happening at the time. There had been some strikes. There was a lot of antagonism between Black and Italian fruit unloaders over wages. I don't think organized labor really wasn't a force at this particular time yet. But as far as the larger companies were concerned, they would just hire whoever was cheapest, and frequently it turned out to be the new Italian arrivals. So you do see that pattern of the guys in charge of the company sort of trying to divide and conquer the labor pool. So you can see the pattern there, but as far as organized labor being a factor in it, it really hadn't arrived yet, I don't think. Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, I think it does, because there's been some commentary as to why haven't we had a Italian American president of the United States?
Sure.
And reaching back, you'll hear people say, well, there has always been that stigma, that
Sure.
fear of Italians and crime. And here it was born by the word mafia.
Yeah.
130 years ago. The term and the judgment, the court proceedings, Dominic was saying earlier, where these people were found innocent.
Yeah. It's something that I think is, for all the strides Italian Americans have made in the country, it's that stigma just refuses to die somehow. One of the presentations I gave in New Orleans, we threw it open to questions afterwards and I'll never forget this elderly man standing up, and he was furious. This would have been about 12 years ago, I think. And he said, when I was a kid, I didn't know, first of all, he said, I didn't know anything about this story. This is the first I'm hearing about this. And he said, when I was a kid, people would call me a dirty dago and try to beat me up. And now I know why. And, from a local perspective, it is a straight line back to that "who killed the chief" insult. And locally, that's how it manifested itself there. But you're right, that whole mafia thing, once it spread, and and later when there were more well publicized organized crime figures, it just doesn't go away. I mean, tell me an immigrant community that didn't have some sort of crime in it.
Yeah. Can you hear me, Tom?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. So I was in Malta, and you have a combination of cultures there. You have Arab culture, you have English, and you have Italian culture there. And they were saying that mafia really came from the word mafiata, which they said meant you took my breath. And so getting back to this idea of people trying to organize and social justice,
Yeah.
I mean, they were fighting for their livelihood, their bread and butter,
Right.
the bread of life.
Mhm.
And they were misnamed to this day.
Interesting.
It's kind of a shock when you stop and think
a little
about
different
it.
spin on it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks, Tom.
John
Thanks so
Lag-
much for writing it.
John Lag is out there.
How you doing?
Comment or question?
Yep, you can hear me okay?
There he
Yeah.
is. Yes.
Good. Hello, how are you?
Hi.
John Maggio, actually. Good. How are you, Dominic? Good. Very good. Go ahead, Dominic.
I'm sorry?
So, John, what was your impression of this story of the lynching and of the book and its reception and the results
So
of
a couple things. When you can't understand the answers, I've learned is that it's always the money, some sort of financial interest. Again, people are always fighting immigrants, especially the bottom of the lower rungs, if you will, socioeconomic ladders, are always fighting over the same piece of bread, I always say. So somehow, some way, built up animosity. This was a straw that broke the back, probably where pent up animosity toward a certain ethnic group was unleashed here, is my guess, and probably had to do with jobs, people fighting for the same kind of jobs. If I understand what the animus was, that's usually it, but who knows? Yeah, Tom knows better than I, but a couple things that Carla mentioned there too, if you don't mind. You mentioned too, again, Italians and former slaves at the time were sort of in the same boat, if you will, especially in New Orleans. My grandmother was born in New Orleans, 1898, immigrated to New Orleans. My father's side, Lagatudis Durso family, came from New York. She lived on a plantation and she related to me. Again, I'm sure her parents at the time were plantation workers of some sort. That was the job. And she related to me too. And like talking, she called them slaves at the time, quote unquote, is the former slaves. Because at the time it wasn't that long since slavery. There, they weren't formally slaves, but the conditions she described to me were basically dirt poor, dirt floors and little shacks. And the kind of, I'm sure better than conditions than they were a few years before that, but she didn't paint a real rosy picture of it. The plantation eventually burnt to the ground, and that's how they moved up to Chicago area. But again, economics too. Italians didn't come in here from a position of wealth, and it came in a position of destitute and looking for opportunities. And they fought over the same piece of bread, if you will. Anyway, those are my impressions, Dominic. Thank you.
I gotta say that's a fascinating piece of family history, because that's it. That's a history that's just starting to be examined. The recruiters who went over and brought in the Italians, a lot from Sicily and other parts of southern Italy, to work on these plantations. And there was a novel published recently that I can highly recommend. It's by Mary Bucci Bush. And it's fiction, but it's based on her own research of her family's story about them living side by side with African American families on this plantation. And that's something we don't hear about too often. So
What's that called?
Put it in the chat, if you will, and again.
Yeah, I'll write it in there.
People can see it. There you go.
I can share one other quick story. This is funny. One of my dad's best friends is from New Orleans, and he's African American. And they used to work together in Boston. And so recently he had his DNA done, my dad's African-American friend. And of course, it came back that he was partially, Sicilian or Italian, Southern Italian or something like that. So he called my dad up and he's like, Lou, we're paisan. I knew I always liked you for a reason. So, and I was saying to my father, I said, knowing the history, that doesn't surprise me at all. So I'll put that book in the chat.
That'd be great. Yeah, getting back to your point about fighting over the same piece of bread, one of the part of the background to this whole story is a feud between two family businesses fighting over the control of the fruit unloading business on the docks. And that's something that set up this whole feud that Hennessy allegedly was going to get involved in, and one of the possible explanations, motives for his murder. But that's a major part of this whole story. Now, whether ultimately was responsible for his death, who knows? But it is one of the theories. But that's definitely a very accurate characterization of what was going on in the dock business in those days.
Okay, on lynching, there's a film that goes back 30 some years, I think. It's called the Linciati, the Italian word for lynching, lynch. the lynched. And I can't remember who, it's a woman who created the film, and we have it here at Casa Italia in our library.
I'm familiar with it.
Italians were the victims of lynching.
I know what you're
Who is?
referring to. I've not seen it, but yeah, sure.
Yeah, she used to come around the American Italian Historical Association, and that's something to Google or whatever,
Yeah.
to go a little around. And there's also the tradition that Italians suffered in the South because they often treated the blacks too well and violated the customs of the Southern whites in being too liberal in their dealings with the African Americans.
Yeah.
And one other point that I always make is that racism was established in the universities, et cetera, until the 1920s. And then, of course, the idea of cultural relativity and equality was radical for that time. And we're just getting into an era that considers the idea that racism is wrong. And so we're just at the beginning of the non-racist era. It's not moving fast enough, might add. I'm
Yeah.
sorry for going on, but anybody else have something that they want to get in to this conversation? Tom, you have a final note?
Well, nothing in particular. If anyone has any questions that occurred to you later, or you want to get in touch with me, you can feel free to get in touch. I can put my email in this chat thing, I suppose, or you can get it from Dominic. But I think it's still a relevant story for a lot of the wrong reasons, unfortunately. So I'm always happy to discuss it with anyone. I can tell you one thing. I just the other day I found a group on Facebook devoted to this whole story. It's called I think it's called Whistles in the Dark, and they have posted quite a few photographs and period illustrations, covers of dime store novels or dime store, comic books, and all kinds of photographs of the grave sites of the participants, background information about both the Italian and established local political establishment figures who were part of all of this. So I've just discovered this stuff was not available to me when I wrote the book. I don't know that the internet existed at that point. So it was a different sort of research project when I did it. But it's kind of, for me, it's enjoyable to find to see what these folks are coming up with.
Whistle in the Dark. What is the reference, Tom?
It's a Facebook group, and let me just check. I wrote it down here somewhere. Whistles in the Night, it's called. And it's
Whistles in the Night.
Whistles. I think it's a reference to the supposed warning whistle to Hennessy's attackers that the chief was walking down the sidewalk. He was approaching, and it was time to get ready to kill him. Which is interesting because if you really get, that's part of the folklore of this case, is that this young Italian boy ran down the sidewalk in the night whistling to alert the assassins that the chief was on his way. And if you actually look at what was presented in court, it's not quite as firm in the historical record. It's just one of those bits of folklore that gets, picks up weight as time goes on and gets presented as fact. A lot of fake news in this story.
Yeah.
Yeah, journalism through the years is not always the same.
No, if you go back and read
Well-
some of the early treatments of this stuff by people who would write about it for historical quarterlies, and try and discern what their biases were versus what actually happened. It's an interesting exercise. You know, I won't get into it now, but I did make note of this, and I gave a long presentation about this one time where I sketched all of this stuff out. And it was interesting seeing that. One of the interesting things about looking at this whole saga is how public perception and the writing of the story has changed over the years. You know, it's just the story depends upon who's telling it, in short.
Okay, well, Tom Smith, thanks for being with us, and we wish you good luck in your future ventures, and
Thank you very much.
I'd like you to remember that.
I certainly will. And thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure.